It's autumn at the Escapist, and that means Schlocktober returns. And no discussion of schlock filmmaking would be complete without talking about infamous B-movie mega-producer Charles Band and Full Moon, the direct-to-video powerhouse of the 80s and 90s that he tried to turn into the independent film version of Marvel Comics, complete with direct merchandising and movie-to-movie continuity. And it might even have worked if the internet fandom-generating machine had existed at the time, and also if the vast majority of movies they ended up putting out weren't, well, not very good. I could probably get several episodes out of the history of Full Moon, but Schlocktober is about movies. So let's talk about my favorite Charles Band Full Moon movie franchise, which also happens to be the most successful and enduring thing pretty much everyone involved ever put out. Puppet Master, a movie series that has spawned something like 10 sequels to date, depending on how you count. The original Puppet Master from 1989 is a weird animal. It almost feels like they wanted to make a haunted house movie, but monsters would be cheaper than ghosts, small monsters would be cheaper than big monsters, and small monsters that were supposed to look like puppets would be cheaper than convincing ones. I don't know if that was the case, but that's kind of what it looks like. Anyway, the movie is set in a coastal hotel and opens in 1939 with a mysterious Geppetto-like marionette maker named Andre Toulon doing his thing, which happens to be making puppets that he can somehow bring to life. A pair of Nazi spies show up looking for him, apparently because Hitler wants to weaponize whatever magic Toulon is using, but the Puppet Master hides his creation in the walls and commits suicide, apparently taking his magic to the grave. 50 years later, a group of psychic investigators converge on the hotel to look into its supposedly haunted history, but really it's because one of them is evil and wants to find Toulon's secret to use it to become immortal. But the puppets are still there, and they get out and kill everybody. That's kind of it. Look, it's just not a very good movie, honestly. But audiences really liked the puppet characters, which, incidentally, for this inaugural run, included Jester, Leechwoman, Tunneler, Pinhead, and franchise mascot Blade. So they did a sequel. Puppet Master 2 was a big improvement, directed by and featuring special effects from stop-motion animation legend David Allen, who got his start on last year's Schlocktober feature Equinox. Toulon, the Puppet Master, rises from the grave as a mummified zombie Phantom of the Opera type guy, and puts the puppets to work killing people to get human brains he needs to make more of the magic formula, which we learn he apparently discovered in Egypt as a younger man. That'll be important later. Tunneler and Leechwoman both check out of this version, but we get a new guy named Torch in the process. It's a fun, sick little horror movie, and I still like the ambiguity of whether Toulon was always evil or has zombie-induced insanity, and it's fun that the puppets always seem to have a side agenda of their own. Puppet Master 3, released the same year, is often referred to as the high point of the series, and it's definitely the most ambitious. It's a prequel set in Nazi Germany, which not only means that Tunneler and Leechwoman get to be back to life, along with a new friend named Six Shooter, but also that the puppets now get to be full-on good guys. It turns out Andre Toulon was using his secretly sentient marionettes to stage satirical anti-Hitler productions, which the Nazis didn't appreciate, plus they want his formula to make immortal soldiers. Toulon's wife gets killed, so he and the puppets go out for revenge on the Third Reich. We also find out that Leechwoman is carrying the soul of Toulon's dead wife, which actually contradicts most of the plot of Part 2, but this is just not the series to worry about things like that in. Puppet Master 4 and Puppet Master 5, the final chapter, were shot back-to-back simultaneously, something Full Moon was doing a lot of during the 90s heyday of straight-to-video horror movies, and intended to be the conclusion of the series. We're back in the present once again with a group of young scientists who discover the puppets while studying artificial intelligence. But the series isn't done expanding its increasingly absurd mythology. It turns out Toulon's magic originally belonged to an Egyptian demon god named Sutek, who takes time out from what you'd have to assume is a busy schedule of tormenting those infernal Power Rangers to dispatch his tiny minions, the totems, to take the magic back. And yeah, that's pretty much the fourth and fifth movie. The now good puppets versus evil puppets and more or less the devil. Works for me, and that was supposed to be the end of it. Unfortunately, Full Moon never quite found a franchise as popular or as marketable as this one, so 4 years later, in 1998, we got Curse of the Puppet Master, which undermines the mostly happy ending of Part 5 to place the puppets at the mercy of a new evil master who goes to murderous lengths to try and create a master race of puppets for himself. It doesn't end well for him, or really for anyone who actually has to watch this movie. The next year gave us Retro Puppet Master, another prequel with young Andre Toulon fighting the Nazis with unfinished beta versions of the puppets, a premise which sounds absolutely nothing like an excuse to create variants for Full Moon's briefly profitable and now highly collectible in-house toy line. And yes, that is indeed Greg Sestero, aka Mark from The Room, as the young Toulon.
Oh, hi, Mark.
3 years later, they put out Puppet Master Legacy, which is, I kid you not, basically just a clip show of all the previous movies that attempts to explain the series' continuity up to that point, which turns out to be fruitless because it just gets more confusing after that. See, the details as to why are a little fuzzy, but at some point Band and Full Moon actually lost control of their own licenses, which allowed the Sci-Fi Channel to produce Puppet Master vs. Demonic Toys. Demonic Toys being another Band-produced Killer Small Things series that had itself last been seen in another crossover, Doll Man vs. Demonic Toys. Yeah, Charles Band's seems to have a thing about tiny monsters. But whatever, this was bad even for Puppet Master, and Full Moon subsequently reclaimed the rights and branded this one not part of the official canon, which they themselves picked back up recently with Puppet Master Axis of Evil in 2010 and Puppet Master Axis Rising just last year. These are prequels again, this time set in the US in the early 1940s, and concerning a young man who befriends Toulon at the hotel from the first two movies shortly before his death and sets about borrowing and protecting the puppets we'd previously believed remained at the hotel that whole time. Instead, it turns out they were running around protecting America from Nazi agents and eventually evil Nazi puppets the whole time. Fine, whatever, works for me. But you know, it's funny. None of the Puppet Master movies individually are all that good. 2 through 5 are fun, sure, but there isn't a masterpiece in the bunch if we're being honest. And yet, taken as a whole, they kind of add up to something endearing, actually kind of impressive. It's an incredibly odd series to devote this much effort and myth-making to, but they've been doing these for 25 years. Eventually, admiring the kind of bizarre dedication that went into that starts to rub off on the movies themselves. So, yeah, go watch some Puppet Master movies, you might like them. Next week, Schlocktober continues. I'm Bob, and that's the big picture. This year, Schlocktober happens to coincide with the arrival of a new season of The Walking Dead. The cultural phenomenon wherein a comic that was really okay became an AMC TV series that is also really okay. The series has been lauded by some for its richly developed characters and admirable sense of scope given the limitations of a television budget, but criticized by others for supposedly skimping on zombie action. That's the funny thing about zombies as monsters, though. They work as a threat you can put in the background while focusing on human drama, because once you've seen them, you've kind of seen them. Also, they just aren't the scariest monster by design. They just aren't, I'm sorry. The idea behind a zombie is creepy, and they're often gross looking, but they don't have the immediate credible threat thing happening like a werewolf or the alien or whatever. I mean, unless there's a lot of them, or if you goose them up with enough extra bits or implausible speed that they aren't really zombies anymore, but that's a whole other show. That might be why one of the places they've turned out to work best is in horror comedies. They're kind of silly in their fundamental conception to begin with, and they're an easy shorthand for grotesque parody of humanity just by standing around. Of course, today everyone's go-to zombie comedy is Shaun of the Dead, or maybe Fido if we're being too cool for school, but way before any of our recent zomcoms, the Asian cinema market was digging a 1998 gore and gags underground hit from director Wilson Yip called BioZombie. Boiled down to its base elements, BioZombie is a Hong Kong riff on George Romero's Dawn of the Dead, inasmuch as it features a zombie outbreak at an indoor shopping mall, but premise is where similarities end, as Yip's film is more interested in slapstick comedy, observational youth culture satire, and whiplash-inducing shifts from those lighter elements to genuine zombie horror. Zombie and zombie-esque movies have often been a place for young auteurs to prove their mettle, like Sam Raimi or Peter Jackson, and Yip followed suit. BioZombie was his first significant hit, and 1 year later he directed Bullets Over Summer, which launched a dramatic career, that now includes several high-profile collaborations with Donnie Yen. Amusingly, BioZombie also functions as a time capsule of Hong Kong youth culture just after the '97 handover. For example, apparently the Game Boy camera was a bigger deal there than in the West. Our heroes are a pair of juvenile delinquents named Woody Invincible and Crazy Bee, which I'm told is supposed to be a joke about the literal Chinese names for the leads in the Toy Story movies, but I don't speak enough Mandarin to confirm that. In any case, Woody and Crazy think of themselves as badass criminal operators, but really they're just morons whose big game is running a bootleg VCD shop, ask your parents. In their downtime, they annoy women at the mall and carry out random errands for their shady boss. One such errand, and their utter incompetence in carrying it out, lands them in possession of a body infected with a zombifying chemical agent, which they bring back to the mall, and you know the rest. What's interesting about BioZombie is, despite how wild it eventually goes with its undead slaughterfest, how oddly restrained it is beforehand. This was likely more a function of budget than pure dramatic inspiration. A non-stop gorefest in the vein of Planet Terror would almost certainly be outside the economic realities of low-budget late 90s Hong Kong filmmaking after all, but whatever the cause, the film takes its time getting to the showpiece stuff. Almost the first full half of the movie is just a day-in-the-life comedy about Hong Kong youth, and as a result we actually get to know our otherwise stock zombie movie protagonists, including Woody, Crazy, two girls named Jelly and Roll, a dweeby food court sushi clerk, and a bickering husband and wife combo, before all the fighting starts. That's not to say there isn't still room for some outright weirdness, like the clerk going zombie himself but remaining just sentient enough to bribe his fellows with people sashimi to give the heroes room to escape. It's also interesting, at least to me, to see the familiar zombie scenario play out in a non-Western and indeed non-American setting. Most zombie flicks aping the American model tend to devolve into gunfight generators, because the American mindset can turn pretty much any crisis scenario into a gunfight generator. But in BioZombie, it's mostly about finding a way to escape the encroaching horde with whatever hand-to-hand weaponry they can grab, which makes for a different kind of battle and allows for this fun, then topical House of the Dead reference.
Love you!
I don't know if BioZombie is going to change any zombie fan's life, honestly. In fact, I can damn near guarantee you that it felt more interesting and vital back in '98 when zombies weren't the most overexposed thing in the history of ever. But it's a fun romp, and since we demonstrably can't get enough of zombies, here's one more movie to add to your collection. I'm Bob, and that's The Big Picture. Zombies. Are you sick of them yet? The Walking Dead started its 4th season this past weekend, and it feels like every other week is bringing us some new movie, book, comic, or video game featuring reanimated corpses as the main antagonist. Zombies seem to speak uniquely to the early 21st century zeitgeist. After all, in a world paradoxically seeming to grow more crowded as we get less dependent on population size for basic mutual needs, what's scarier than being surrounded by endless waves of other people? Plus, they let us work out the age-old colonial/expansionist fantasy of overcoming the savage horde without being, racist about it. So there's that. Hard to believe, then, that only 3 decades ago, during what many consider the last great period for Western horror filmmaking no less, zombies were kind of considered passé. Oh, they turned up. I mean, technically Jason Voorhees has been a zombie since Jason Lives, but back then it was ghosts, slashers, demons, and straight-up monsters time to shine for the most part. On the plus side, that meant when the 80s did deliver a zombie movie, it was often a pretty unique one. Case in point...
Remember the good old days when guns killed people? You're just jealous, that's all!
Ah, the 80s buddy cop movie. There's nothing like it in the world, except all those other movies that are exactly like it. Treat Williams is LAPD Detective Roger Mortis, yeah, it's that kind of movie, and Joe Piscopo is his partner, Detective Doug Bigelow. One is smooth and classy, the other is a boorish slob. The only things they have in common are their sweet ride, getting chewed out by their obligatory angry black captain for kicking too much ass at their jobs, and the shared joy of gunning down street criminals.
Why aren't these guys dead? We've hit them about 50 times each!
Maybe they're just flesh wounds.
Will you cover me, please?
As our story begins, their current case involving a string of armed robberies has hit an interesting snag. 2 of the perps they just sent to the morgue had already been there. The investigation leads to a shady pharmaceutical company that seems to have developed a machine for reanimating dead tissue, which they surmise is being used by somebody to create zombie criminals. Things go to hell and Roger winds up dead, but since it's right there, and well, since this is why they made the movie, Doug and their lady coroner friend use the machine, not totally grasping what it actually does, to bring him back.
You're alive.
Of course I'm alive.
Oh my God.
What is it?
I'm not getting a heartbeat.
And so we have our premise. Roger is now a zombie cop out to solve his own murder.
Hey, you're hurt. Lady, I'm f***ing dead.
What's interesting is that zombies in Dead Heat are strictly dead things that have been zapped back to life, Frankenstein style. There's no supernatural element, no mutations, not even any flesh eating. Things come back in the same state they were when they died and get progressively more zombie looking only because of wear and tear and gradual decay since they don't heal anymore. Granted, it doesn't really explain why this one big guy has 3 faces, but it looks cool, so whatever.
What is this thing? Very ugly!
And it lets them do cool sequences like having Roger and Doug stuck in a Chinese butcher shop where the revivifying technology brings all the meat back to life. Creepy. And then subsequently awesome when they end up fighting what's left of a cow.
How do you fight this thing?
Maybe we could drown it in A1 sauce.
Oh no.
Also fun, Roger doesn't really get all existential about the situation for very long. I mean, he freaks out a little bit, but he gets over it and resolves to use however much time he does have to finish the case and get back at whoever was responsible. Huh, I'm dead. That sucks, but oh well, back on the job. Think how long present-day action heroes like Jason Bourne or Batman would still be whining about this. No time to whine, though, partly because the actual plot is kind of convoluted, to the point where you have to wonder if a bunch of scenes were left on the cutting room floor along with what were allegedly a handful of more extreme gore effects. It's a lot of misdirection and red herring about rich dead people, body switching, the chief medical examiner, and some late-coming Reagan-era social commentary from guest star Vincent Price.
Everybody dies, rich and poor. Death doesn't discriminate. At least not until now.
This is ridiculous.
Well, let's face it. Poor people are supposed to die, but the same rule doesn't apply to us. We're rich. God wants us to live forever. And even if he doesn't, we can always buy him off.
Mostly, though, the screenplay, an early effort by Terry Black, brother of Shane and writer-producer of the Red Steel games, exists to mash up zombie gore and 80s cop movie tropes and sticks with that premise once it gets there. Especially for Act 3 once Roger starts really looking the part of a zombie cop.
Jesus H. Detective Mortis, homicide.
It's not like Dead Heat is some kind of forgotten classic. It's pretty cheesy, but you can probably attribute its memory holding to the presence of Joe Piscopo, 4 years out from having left Saturday Night Live and failing to get any kind of real career traction after that.
I gotta take a leak so bad my teeth are floating. Is there a little boys' room around here? I just got pee-pee.
Well, whatever. 1988's loss can be your gain, since Dead Heat is yet another obscure minor gem just waiting to be rediscovered, even if the only parts that'll really stick with you are the gore and the walking cow carcass.
I'm sorry, Roger. Please forgive me.
Boy, the last 2 of those are pretty gory, huh? Alright, let's slow things down and head back to a simpler time. Like the 1950s, and a more relaxing place. Like, Polynesia. Yeah, the South Sea Islands. That's the ticket. You know, Polynesia has always held a particularly fascinating and frequently problematic fascination for the West and for the United States in particular. I'd talk at length about it, but I'm here to show you a monster movie, and besides, Critical Intel already covered it way better than I could, so just go read that. In any case, mainland American fascination for Polynesian culture, or at least a certain dramatically skewed perception thereof, probably peaked in the 1950s and early 60s, a phenomenon that was at least partially a market reaction to American sailors and servicemen stationed in the region during World War II bringing a taste for the culture home with them, whose mark remains today in the once ubiquitous institution of the Polynesian-style Chinese restaurant. But whatever, an unnamed South Seas island during that charming era of American cultural appropriation is the setting for today's film, which is called... Yeah, one of these. We cold open on somebody in Hollywood's idea of an island tribe carrying out the execution of the tribe's now former prince, wrongly accused of having killed his father, the now former chief. What's the beef about?
My father died from the Black Plague.
The devil dust of your American friends killed our great chief. Killed many of our people.
Tano, you fear the Americans because their medicine is stronger than yours. They come here as our friends to help us.
Why didn't the Americans heal your father? You all know I was his father's best friend.
My father was sick and out of his mind with fever. Tano gave him the poison because you wanted to become the new chief.
Yes, the guys who are for some reason suspicious about Western interlopers into their lands are the bad guys. Boy, you really do forget just how long ago the 50s actually were, huh? Anyway, the prince swears vengeance.
You can kill my body, but my spirit will never die. In death, I will be stronger than you in life.
But they kill him anyway and bury him. That's a pretty dark opening. Even the dude's wife sells him out.
Tell them the truth. That Tana and Moronka gave him the evil medicine that killed him.
What medicine, my husband?
That's cold. With that now in place, let's meet our heroes, which, since this is 1957, means let's meet our white people, a group of American scientists who pretty much just hang around being huge douchebags about stuff.
Islands of romance, islands of beauty. How come they never talk about the malaria and the jungle rot? The fever and the heat? The stupid, blind ignorance and those drums?
I'll tell you who poisons their simple minds. It's Tano, their witch doctor. He's afraid of losing his patients to modern medicine. Wants to keep them steeped in their centuries-old superstitions.
Why did I have to fall in love with a dedicated female scientist? She considers marriage some kind of prison.
What do you expect from a pretty girl 2 years out of med college?
Wow. You know, other times you forget how not that long ago the 50s actually were. Yikes. What are they supposedly doing on this island?
You mean they were peaceful enough until they dropped that atom bomb on the Nogassa Atoll?
1,500 miles from here. Who would have thought that a freak typhoon could come from out of nowhere and wreck all calculations?
Well, the facts remain that the atomic fallout landed here, and that we trusty scientists from the International Foundation came running with our little Geiger counters to investigate.
And what did we find? Plague. That's what's killing off the natives. It's not the fallout.
Convoluted! If that was supposed to be funny and not just bending over backwards to make sure this could be about the atomic age and still have these be the unquestioned heroes, it'd be funny. But let's get down to the good stuff. The prince makes good on his "if you strike me down" boast, but all he manages to do is make a ridiculous-looking tree grow out of his grave. The natives think there's something obviously fishy about the tree having the executioner's knife still sticking out of its trunk, but our hero's reaction is, hey, you know what'd be fun? Let's dig it up and inject it with radioactive chemicals.
Look, why keep this freak of nature alive? Your interest in it is morbid.
Bill, it's purely scientific. And if you weren't so concerned with your natives and their silly taboos, you'd be helping us, not standing by doing nothing.
And so the embodiment of tribal vengeance shudders to life as Tabunga. Yeah, that's our monster. Walking Tree Stump. Tabunga was designed by Paul Blasdell, the legendary low-budget monster maker who was also responsible for the She Creature, the Crab Monsters, the Saucer Men, the It That Conquered the World, and the It from Beyond Space. The actual suit in this case was built by Don Post Studios, the guys who more or less invented latex Halloween masks. Like a lot of Blasdell's creations, Tabunga was a really interesting design that just doesn't look good moving around. At all. And that's pretty much why From Hell It Came is infamous. As Tabunga wreaks terrible vengeance on everyone responsible for wronging the prince, we get scene after scene of people trying really hard to look afraid or overpowered by one of the most obviously immobile, unwieldy monsters in movie history. It's especially funny at the climax, once they've sussed out that Tabunga's weak spot might be that giant f***ing knife sticking out of its chest. Clearly, even Stephen Hawking would have no difficulty just rolling up and nudging the damn thing in there, but since we're pretending this thing is supposedly too deadly to approach, they opt to do it with a rifle. Yeah, that looks like it would work. From Hell It Came was not particularly successful upon its release, even by the standards of micro-budget drive-in monster fare. Legend has it one of its early reviews famously quipped, "And to hell it can go." But like so many of its contemporaries, it gained notoriety among younger monster fans thanks to airing as a reliable time filler on late-night TV. Schlocktober will conclude next week. I'm Bob, and that's the big picture. When it comes to the legends of schlock cinema, there are names everybody knows. At this point, most casual film buffs can name-check Roger Corman and Ed Wood, Mystery Science Theater fans are aware of the iconoclastic Coleman Francis, and vintage erotica fans still celebrate the career of one Doris Wishman. But one name that often gets overlooked is Al Adamson, who was probably the last of the great drive-in hucksters, and whose 1963 to 1985 career nicely bridged the gap between the Sam Arkoff and Jason Voorhees eras of low-budget indie genre movies. Adamson directed and/or produced a slew of films with titles like Dracula vs. Frankenstein, The Blood of Ghastly Horror, Psycho a Go-Go, and Blazing Stewardesses, but he also had a canny eye for undiscovered gems, aka unlikely potential profits in his own right, and in 1970 he thought he'd hit pay dirt when he happened upon the purchase of rights to a bizarre 1956 feature from the Philippines called Tagani. Well, actually it was called Kararang Bato, a star vehicle for one-time Philippine superstar Jesus Rampo. Tagani was the title given to its barely released English-language dubbed version. It's a Stone Age action-adventure movie in which brave heroes of a tribe battle a clan of vampire cavemen. Yeah, how about that? I mean, yeah, they fight other monsters and stuff, but still, vampire cavemen. Problem facing Adamson was, Filipino action movies didn't have the same exotic cash in the US as, say, Japanese monster movies, and besides that, by 1970 even the drive-ins were demanding their movies be in color. Tagani was in black and white. How would he salvage the investment? Well, Adamson went out and shot new footage himself, then chopped bits and pieces out of some other low-end movies he either owned or were in the public domain at the time, chiefly the original 1 Million Years BC, The Wizard of Mars, and War of the Satellites, among others, and remixed all of this with the caveman versus monster stuff that drew him to Tagani in the first place. And so, in 1970, all that came together as
The Horror of the Blood Monsters.
Our story, the planet Earth, or at least this one dark alley on the planet Earth, is under attack by an outbreak of real-life vampires. Somehow, NASA has determined that vampirism actually originated from a recently discovered far-off planet, and has dispatched an astronaut team led by the legendary but now very, very tired John Carradine to investigate and neutralize the bloodsucker threat. Oh, and it's actually never spelled out that this is why they're going to the planet, since the vampire outbreak thing doesn't really come up again, and it feels like maybe the vampires on Earth were like a last-minute addition among all the other last-minute additions, but you know what? It still makes more sense than Prometheus did.
The infected blood of the vampire was carried to Earth millions of years ago by the two-bitten vampire men of a distant galaxy far beyond this solar system.
Oh, and because drive-ins were also demanding sex scenes, one of the NASA guys borrows some technology to take home and mess around with his lady friend.
And, blue. Right now, I'd like some relaxation. In any color.
Wow, that is the least sexy thing I've ever seen. Anyway, the astronauts reach the planet and discover that it's inhabited by Stone Age humanoids. Yup, this is how we're gonna get the Tagani footage into this train wreck. Adamson took the astronaut actors to Bronson Canyon, the backdrop to more low-budget sci-fi movies and TV shows than pretty much any other single location on the planet, and shot black and white footage of them wandering around, occasionally interacting with one or two Asian or Filipino-looking co-stars, but mostly reacting to stuff happening off-screen, which he would then cut together with the Tagani footage to give the impression that our quote-unquote heroes were observing the trials and tribulations of these newly discovered alien tribesmen. But how'd they get around the theaters only want color issue? Well, you're looking at it. And if you don't see it yet, the vampire at the beginning actually explains it.
The strange chromatic radiations of deep, dark space have created many ghastly mutations while they turn the air and everything in it into a one-colored mass of yellow, green, blue, or blood red.
chromatic radiation. Translation, they just randomly tinted the old black and white footage and the new black and white footage red, blue, green, or yellow from scene to scene on the premise that, well, the planet probably has a weird atmosphere and it does that. So yes, Horror of the Blood Monsters was released to theaters in color, and yet most of it was still in monochrome. You know, in a way I'm glad it takes so long to explain how this happened, because beyond that there's nothing other to say than, look at this thing. Are you seeing this?
They look like some kind of prehistoric monsters.
Seriously, are you seeing this? What's great is, if you go by the poster, these lobster men are the blood monsters. Keep in mind, all this insanity with the cave people is the reason they went to all the extra effort to make this movie. People paid money to see this. Actual money. And not even on TV. You had to go somewhere to watch this.
Dr. Reining, are you all right?
I'm all right. I'm all right. Leave me alone.
I got nothing, guys. I got nothing for that either.
It wasn't enough for them merely having the knowledge of such weapons. They had to use them. I have no doubt we'll be equally brilliant one day.
So, yeah, that's Horror of the Blood Monsters. Adamson would make somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 more films after this, but sadly, his story didn't have a happy ending. He was actually murdered in 1995 by a contractor who'd been hired to remodel his home, and the body was discovered entombed under his own whirlpool. That's kinda depressing, actually. Really wish that didn't have to be the capper on this one. Huh. And so, Schlocktober comes to an end for another year. Hope everyone had fun. I know I did. I'm Bob, and that's the big picture.